Alright, so in this video we're just talking about just briefly going over a lot of the stuff that we went over in class as far as the history of Latin America, and then going into these Zapatista movements and the Cuban Revolution, which happened more recently. But we're going to start out with the Aztecs, kind of do a little bit of review about the Aztecs. So at the time of the European exploration, the Aztec civilization, of course, the most powerful of all civilizations in central and southern Mexico, just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of that. Of course, the biggest thing to remember about the Aztecs is that their capital city is Tenochtitlan, and then is now going to be changed into Mexico City once the Spanish conquistadors come over and start to settle for themselves. But for the most part, the Aztecs took up a good portion. You can see this in the picture there. A good portion of modern-day Mexico towards the central part. The border stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, and they controlled lands as far as south as today's Guatemala as well. An important part of the Aztec culture was the sacrifice of animals and humans. This is something that we've talked about a pretty good bit in class. People who were conquered by the Aztecs were required to pay a large amount of taxes, and they also had to provide people to offer as a sacrifice to the Aztec gods. And the reasoning behind this, of course, was that they literally thought that the world was going to stop if they didn't appease the gods in some way and offer themselves up or offer other people up as a sacrifice to their particular gods. The Aztec had a complex, rich society. They had a mathematical system to keep up with their empire, and they had two different calendar systems to organize their empire. And so this is kind of an example of one of those in particular. So it wasn't like they were a primitive society that basically was in the Stone Age. They had a very complex society even before the Europeans got here. Cortez, of course, one of the conquistadors that comes over. Cortez comes over to overtake the Aztecs, and he was concerned that some of his men would be frightened by the Aztecs. So to make sure that nobody tried to escape back to Cuba, Cortez had all the ships destroyed. And this is really important in particular right here, because Cortez is basically telling his men when he comes over to try to take over the Aztecs that one or two things was going to happen. Either they were going to succeed or they were going to die. That was pretty much their only two options. And that's really important to remember. The ruler of the Aztecs was Montezuma II, this guy right here. And due to the fact that Montezuma, he believed that Cortez might actually be the returning Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. And this was kind of a tradition, a story that had been told for years in Aztec culture, that this god Quetzalcoatl had left and that he was actually going to be coming back. So when the conquistadors came and found the land that the Aztecs were at, they thought that they might actually be this god coming back, Quetzalcoatl. So let's skip up to the Inca civilization for just a little bit. And of course, the Incas are all along the Pacific side of South America here, the green part in South America, in a lot of places, basically in present-day Colombia and Chile, and lived along the western coast of South America. The Inca were known for a lot of great achievements as well. So again, these guys aren't primitive people. Before the Europeans get here, they actually have a pretty complex society. They made beautiful gold, silver, and bronze pieces, had a lot of natural resources. Their leaders even had rooms of gold and silver in his palace, so that's really important. The Inca also managed to farm in difficult areas. So you can see through this picture that this is a very mountainous terrain over here. But the way that they did it was by terraces. So they would basically create steps along the side of the mountain, and they could then farm these particular areas in between the steps. So it gave them more flat land in order to farm. That's extremely important. So just an overview of some of the major people that we talked about. Atahualpa and Pizarro, okay? And these guys you need to link with the Incan Empire. Of course, Pizarro is the guy that's going to take over and defeat Atahualpa, and so you can review this chart. You got this in class to look over as well. And then these two guys you need to link with the Aztec Empire. Of course, Cortez is the conquistador from Spain that takes over from Montezuma, and Montezuma is murdered by Cortez. So this is really a good chart to study when looking at these four guys. There's also something that was really important that the Aztec had developed themselves, and to produce enough food to support their population, the Aztec constructed what was called chinampas, and these are raised garden beds in swampland or shallow water. So this is kind of an example. You see these chinampas over here to the side, and they were used for farming. So remember, Tenochtitlan was actually a city in the middle of a lake, just like what we see over here. Tenochtitlan was a city in the middle of a lake, in the middle of Lakes Texcoco. So this was really important for them to figure out a way to effectively use more farmland, the Aztecs. Okay, so we've seen this one in particular, again, this slide. But let's look at the Columbian Exchange for just a second. This picture is one that's posted on the website, and this would be something that's really good to study as well. If you want to, you can pause the video and kind of look at the Columbian Exchange to get a good idea of what took place in the Columbian Exchange. But basically, the Columbian Exchange is what initially happens when the Europeans come over to the New World. And so there's several things that are exchanged back and forth. In particular, from Europe, you've got all these diseases that are exchanged and brought over to the New World. Diseases that they had never heard of, that they definitely weren't immune to, but they also have a lot of natural resources, grains and livestock that's brought over to the New World. But a lot of the natural resources come from the New World to the Old World as well. So it's kind of hard to imagine. Again, I like to point this out in particular. It's kind of hard to imagine Italian food, which is in, of course, the Old World. It's hard to imagine Italian food without tomatoes. But if it wasn't for the Columbian Exchange, Italian food wouldn't have tomatoes because it came from the New World. All right, and then the triangular trade is a result of the Columbian Exchange. So they're not the same thing, but the triangular trade is basically a result. It's the exchange of goods, people, and diseases between the Old World and the New World. And it created a pattern between Europe, Africa over here, and then the Americas over here. They sent slaves to the Americas, textiles and manufactured goods to Africa, sugar, tobacco, and cotton to Europe. All right, and this is the social hierarchy chart, of course, that gave you copies of in particular. But this is important to really understand how Latin American society was made up. On the top, you've got peninsulares, people that were born in Spain and were of Spanish descent. Below these guys, you've got Creoles, which are people of pure European blood, but the only difference is they were born in the New World. So they are, everything in society, in Latin American society, was based on race. Then underneath that, you got mestizos, Indian and European blood, and then mulattoes underneath them, which is African and European blood. And then on the very bottom of society are Indians and Africans, people that are native, indigenous in the population in the Americas, and Africans who are brought over as slaves. So these three guys are really important to remember, and I gave you, y'all have copied this down, and we've talked about this pretty in depth in class. But I'm just going to kind of do a big overview. You can pause and study this particular slide if you'd like to. But Miguel Hidalgo, biggest thing, he's from Mexico. He's a Creole, as a lot of the liberators are going to be. And he gave up a lot of his wealth to become a priest. He basically helps lead a revolution against Spain and create the nation of Mexico. But it's actually going to happen after he dies, because the outcome, what takes place actually, is that Miguel Hidalgo is captured and killed by a firing squad. 10 years later, afterwards, Mexico gains independence. Toussaint Louverture, he's from Haiti, and he's gaining independence from France. The importance of Toussaint and the Haitian Revolution is that it's basically the only real successful slave revolution in history, and they're able to establish their own country. And then you got Simon Bolivar, and he's from basically a lot of different countries. He wanted to establish a country called Gran Colombia, but today it's a lot of different countries: Bolivia, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela. And so he helped get all these countries gain independence from Spain. All right, Cuban Revolution, bringing it up a couple hundred years basically to 1959, and it's the same general geographical area, so that's why we're talking about it. But it's a revolution that led to the overthrow of General Fulgencio Batista, and that's this guy right here, on January 1st, 1959. Led by Fidel Castro, who up until last few years was still the leader in Cuba. His brother Raul Castro is the leader now. And it begins basically Cuba as a rule under communists. Impact of the Cuban Revolution. This is extremely important, what you definitely have to know. The biggest impact is communism. Cuba is the only communist country in the Western Hemisphere, which is going to be a big problem with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a dictatorship. The U.S. has an embargo, which means we ain't trading with Cuba anymore, is basically what that means. Restricted freedom for Cubans. But also, here's a positive impact, and this is really interesting, what we talked about in class. All Cubans have access to health care and education. It's all government provided, and they don't have as much. They don't have nearly as much freedom as we do. But it is an interesting outcome that comes with the Cuban Revolution. So, Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, not too long, 1962, not too long after the Cuban Revolution, the CIA learned of the Soviet Union building nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is a big problem for the U.S. because we are 90 miles from the coast of Florida. And obviously they would definitely be able to hit almost any city in the United States with a nuclear missile if they were allowed to do this. The world came close to nuclear war before compromise, but missiles were eventually removed. All right, Zapatista guerrillas. This is a group of Mexicans who supported improved rights and living conditions for Mexico's indigenous people. It's named after Emiliano Zapata. A mestizo, again, this is extremely important while we spent so much time talking about the racial makeup in Latin America. Mestizo who lived in the early 20th century and fought for the rights of native people in Mexico. The uprising is focused in the Mexican state of Chiapas. So this is where the main focus is. Chiapas is a resource-rich state in southern Mexico, but it is also the poorest state in Mexico. The reasoning behind it, a lot of it has to do with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we'll talk more about definitely in the Canadian unit. And the North American Free Trade Agreement came into effect, allowed free trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It happened in 1994. Some people in Mexico didn't like this plan. They thought that NAFTA would allow cheap farm goods to come into Mexico from the U.S., and thought that NAFTA benefited the wealthy and hurt the poor Native American farmers by lowering prices of crops like coffee and corn. Farmers in Mexico would not be able to compete with cheaper food. That's the way that they felt about it. So on the day that NAFTA took effect, the Zapatista took over 7 towns in their part of Mexico. So this is even more recent. This is, of course, 1994, not that long ago. The Mexican army was sent to remove the Zapatistas, and fighting lasted for several weeks. A ceasefire eventually ended the fighting, but the Zapatistas did not go away. All right, so that's just a little bit of an overview of what we've talked about in this unit, and I hope this has been a help to you.